Hi, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi, and this week in my Print Eye on China column, I dug into Chinese discourse on the name change of the US Indo-Pac to its previous name, US Pac Command. So the Indo-Pacific is again in the news, and now this time it isn't about China, but it's actually very, very worrisome for the US allies and partners in the region. But then China is also watching closely. Why? Because of the purpose, why it was renamed in the first place, and now why there is this restoration of the name. And also about the timing. So it was actually announced during the recent G7 summit, and the United States US Department of War announced that the US Indo-Pac Command would revert to its former name, US Pacific Command. So the timing and purpose, something that Chinese are discussing on the internet, the strategic community is discussing. On the surface, it of course looks like a simple administrative change, a cosmetic change, but in practice, it has actually triggered a wave of speculation about what it signals for US strategy in the region. And of course, the Indo-Pacific was something that was considered as an anti-China coalition construct. So, of course, naturally, China is discussing that. And some Chinese observers interpret this as an evidence of inconsistency in Washington's regional approach. The argument is that the US has oscillated between an expansive Indo Pacific framework and a narrower Pacific centered focus. So they suggest that there is uncertainty rather than any strategic clarity in the US strategic outlook. So, of course, that was also discussed in the US NSS, the security strategy. The focus on the Pacific was something that was talked about, and now with the name change, this is also being linked to that. So, now why this old name has been brought back? So, one line of interpretation on the Chinese internet is that it's partly institutional, which was also announced by the US Department of War. It is seen as a return to military roots and an attempt to reinforce organizational identity. Um, so, so this is mostly about its historical root. But a second explanation links the move to America First priorities. In this reading, in this framing, dropping Indo signals a more concentrated focus on the Western Pacific alongside continued expectations of allied burden sharing. Then this is one of the most talked about uh, talking points of the Trump administration, that how he has been asking the allies, the partners in the region to share the burden. The security burden sharing is something that is very, very prominent line of argument of the Trump administration. But then a third factor relates to shifting regional alignments, particularly under what some Chinese commentators refer to as, of course, burden sharing, but also something that Trump is withdrawing from the Indo Pacific as well. Within this discourse, India is discussed in terms of its evolving role in US strategy and whether this deterioration in the relationship that we have seen in the past year is weakening the coherence of the Indo Pacific concept itself. And in this context, Hu Shichin, who is a commentator and former editor in chief of the Global Times, he has argued that this reflects a broader recalibration of India's positioning within the US Indo Pacific strategy. And in his view, India remains part of the US strategic calculations. But Washington may no longer feel the need to anchor its approach within the Indo Pacific framing. Then other Chinese analysts offer a more operational explanation. They argue that the Indo Pacific concept was initially used to justify an expanded maritime strategy, but that the US has struggled to implement it consistently across such a wide theater, and now its resources are overstretched because of the ongoing conflict. So it was just not very feasible and possible for the US to maintain its expanded Indo Pacific strategy. Then one scholar described this as a tension between conceptual ambition of the US and its execution capacity. Then this strategy expanded further and faster than the US resources and attention could realistically support. From this perspective, reverting to Pacific Command is less about ideological changes in the US administration It is hardly about what the US is thinking about the Indo Pacific, but more about practicality, narrowing the focus back to the core operational theater in the Western Pacific. And there is also a political interpretation of that. And some analysts suggest that the term Indo Pacific carries a more confrontational tone in Chinese discourse, and that this name change reflects a preference for less loaded terminology, where the US is less hostile and less confrontational towards China. But even here, the consensus is that this is not a major strategic reset. Then another commentator raises a more fundamental question: why reverse a decision made in the first Trump administration? The answer that the commentator offered is twofold. First, the change is seen as largely symbolic, with limited long term policy consequences. Second, it demonstrates shifting strategic perceptions in Washington itself rather than a stable doctrine. And across these interpretations, there is one recurring theme in Chinese discourse, and that is this is not really about India. And this is a line of argument that we have been seeing in Indian media as well as in Western media. But in Chinese discourse, India is not seen as a primary reason behind this name game. And they believe this is more about overall US strategic coherence. Still, the Indo Pacific framework was widely understood in China as part of a broader effort to build an anti China alignment, with India positioned as a key balancing actor. And from that perspective, any adjustment to the framing naturally attracts attention. And of course, India is being discussed across the world, across the global media. And then some voices even suggest that a narrower Pacific focus could reduce the coherence of that broader coalition building effort, and that might potentially ease pressure on China in short term. But there is another reading as well. A separate strand of commentary argues that this may not signal a retreat at all and might not be a relief for China. Instead, it could indicate a sharper concentration of US military attention on the Western Pacific, alongside greater expectations that allies such as Japan, Philippines, and Australia would take more of a role on the front line. And in that sense, the shift could still translate into sustained or even intensified strategic pressure on China, just in a more geographically concentrated form. And what is clear from the Chinese debate is that there is no consensus that this represents appeasement towards China or softening an approach that would entail a less period where there is hardly any US China competition. They believe that the US China geopolitical rivalry is going to continue, whether the US pack is going to be Indo pack or US pack. This has nothing to do with the US China geopolitical competition because the fundamental nature of the US China relations remain the same. And the rivalry remains the baseline assumption of the US China relationship. So the more consistent conclusion is very different from what we are actually seeing in the Indian media and the Western media. And this is being read as another example of inconsistency in the US strategic signaling. And there's hardly any relief for China in terms of contestation in the Indo Pacific or with the US. And many analysts in China also expect that this change may not be permanent and could actually be reversed again in the future. So again, the very inconsistency and coherence that we are talking about in Trump administration. So for now, the Indo-Pacific may have been dropped from the nameplate, but in strategic terms, it is far from disappearing. And this is what the Chinese internet is talking about. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.